Good evening, and welcome to this week's this edition of Public Affairs, Public Access. My name is Quinta Wiltz, your host, representative of the League of Women Voters Speakers Bureau. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight we have some very special guests with us, elected officials and representatives from the various parties in Harris County. And we'll start off by introducing them. To my left, I've got Paul Simpson, the chair of the Harris County GOP, Lane Lewis, chair of the Harris County Democratic Party. I've got Mr. Orlando Sanchez, treasurer for Harris County, and Judge Mike Engelhart with us as well.
Good evening.
All right, so what we want to do is definitely get started. There's something that is very sacred to our democracy, to our country, and that is voting. And right now, as many people know, we're in that time of year where we're starting to see a lot of the campaign commercials. And so we want to really get out information to get people informed and make sure that they have everything they need to participate in the election. So what I'd like to do is kind of go around the table and if you could, give us some information to the voters that are out there, something that you feel like you want to make sure they know about, specifically the dates, and I'll say it. Early voting starts in a couple weeks. If you haven't registered to vote, you aren't able to participate in this upcoming primary. But the early voting dates start February 16th. They end on February 26th, and the primaries are March the 1st. So if you could give us some information locally as to where people should go to vote.
Absolutely. You're asking me?
Yes, Paul.
Paul Simpson, County Chair of the Republican Party. Lots of times voters may not understand exactly what kind of election we're coming up versus what we have in the fall, and that's important. The election that's just about to happen is a primary election in which the Republicans go and select their candidates and Democrats will go and select their candidates. And then in the fall, those candidates and maybe some others that get on the ballot will be running against each other in November. So the election coming up, you mentioned, is early voting actually starts February 16th. We're less than 2 weeks away. And the election is March 1, Election Day. And in Texas, you don't register by party. A lot of people, like I grew up in Louisiana, where you registered by party. And here, you just register to vote, and then you go into the polls, and you get to pick which party you want to vote in. And so, at least in the initial round, and so you can walk in the polls and go vote as a Republican or go vote as a Democrat, either one, and to help select that party's candidates. And I must say, I think we're going to have very large turnout in a presidential year like this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I hear that a lot when I'm out, when people will say, well, I'm a registered Republican or I'm a registered Democrat. And it's like, well, actually, no, you're not. That doesn't exist in Texas. Your party affiliation is dictated by which primary you vote in. And so I encourage people to choose carefully because that's how our targeting is done. And I'm sure Chairman Simpson does it the same way. If you go over to the Democratic side, if you're a Republican, you go over to vote in the Democratic primary just because you want to vote against this person or that person. You can expect a lot of phone calls from Democrats and no complaining as to why. So yeah, I would also encourage people when they're going down there to really focus also on the down ballot races. I know Judge Engelhart is here and he'll speak to that as well. It's very, very important that people go down that ballot and vote for the judges. I like to tell people, when you're voting, think about where that individual's desk is going to be when they get elected, because the closer that desk is to your front door, the more of an impact they're going to have on your daily life. And Judge Engelhart in his position, or district attorney, etc., it's great to get excited about president, but that DA or that judge is going to be sitting a lot closer to your front door than the next president's going to.
Yes, and Mr. Sanchez, you're currently the treasurer for Harris County, correct?
I am.
So how does voting affect, Harris County in that regard, in your position?
Well, as both the chairs talked about, I think all votes are important, but Lane talked about going down ballot. I'm one of those down ballot candidates that most people are not rushing to the polls to vote for their local treasurer. But it's an important fiscal position. And it is a sizable county, and with a budget, when you take in all the money we handle, in excess of $3 billion. And so these are important races. The tax assessor collector, for example, is responsible for registering voters. The county clerk is responsible for sending out the early ballots by mail. He is responsible for counting the votes, assuring the security of the ballot process. And so all these are important positions, and a lot of people get wrapped up in the presidential year thinking, I'm going to go vote. And then, you see the huge drop-off in the judicial races and the administrative races down ballot. So as Lane says and as Paul says, go all the way down the ballot.
Judge?
Well, okay, so the time period to sign up to be on the primary ballot for both parties was the beginning of December, or the middle of December. And it has been, and will have been, about a 10-week sprint for dozens and dozens of candidates around the county. And, at my level, I'll be on the ballot in November, and thankfully I don't have a primary opponent this year, so I will be the nominee of my party for re-election to my particular bench. But I see the enthusiasm of candidates around the county, and they are working so hard because there are so many contested primary races. And I want your viewers to understand the gauntlet that candidates have to go through and why they deserve your consideration from either party. There are so many organizations and clubs and committees that screen candidates carefully. They go through painstakingly, candidate by candidate, race by race, to find out who they want to endorse in a particular primary, and that in their tens of them around the county that these candidates have to go through, and so they are supremely vetted by the people in this county, at least indirectly. And so when it comes time for early voting, February 16th, or the March 1st primary, you can be sure that these people have been thoroughly vetted and worked extremely hard to be on this ballot and deserve your consideration, because the jobs that each one of these people is going to be doing has a significant impact on your day-to-day life. I interact with the public all the time, every day, with jury duty, with trying cases, with the lawyers and the litigants who come down to my court. It's a civil district court, and it has a direct impact on your pocketbook and on your how much time and how efficient the court runs in terms of how long you have to be down there for jury service.
So now that's interesting, because as a judge, the criteria that you have to campaign or cannot campaign, you're held to different standards.
They are.
And you're not the typical candidate. So what are some of the things that highlight, maybe a couple things that maybe would stand out for people to know that you cannot do or you are able to do as a candidate?
As a judicial candidate, we're governed by the canons of judicial ethics.
Okay.
And so we cannot, for example, endorse candidates. I may have my own preference. I can certainly vote for whoever I want to vote for, but I can't stand out I can't give a speech and I can't say I endorse so-and-so or I'm supporting so-and-so for this. So it's sometimes I have to bite my tongue, and it's very painful when I see my friends go through this primary process and I want to shout for the rooftops, this is the best candidate. Trust me, you already voted for me. I'm your incumbent. Trust me, I know what I'm talking about. This is the hardest working, most qualified candidate, but I can't say it. Yeah. I can't say it. And so I stand away from them. I'll maybe shake their hand when I want to give them a hug. I have to be very careful of my public visibility and and what these clubs and organizations that I'm also asking for them to get fired up and come back and vote in November and work for the whole rest of the year to get Democrats fired up for November. But I can't, and so I go to all these clubs and all these meetings, and I kind of stand there quietly and observe. But inside, I want to be shouting from the rooftops.
So now, as a judge, because you mentioned it just briefly, you're on the Democratic ticket.
I am.
Are there any judges that are on the? Can you run independently, or do you have to declare a party? You're looking at Paul. So
if you want to win, the answer is you don't get to. There's always a libertarian, or historically there's always been a libertarian on the ballot.
And Green Party.
And Green Party is another one, right? And they'll get 2 or 3%. But to be viable these days in Harris County, it has to be a presidential year if you're a Democrat, unfortunately, and then,
or fortunately,
right? And then B, you've got to be one of those two parties,
Okay, so
as a
go-
practical matter.
No, Paul, I know you wanted to say.
Well, I just want to pick up on something the judge has been saying. I think it's important for viewers to know because Texans love to elect people. We don't like to appoint judges. We don't like to appoint JPs. We don't like to appoint anybody. So that's why we have such a long ballot in Harris County. I believe, I've had discussion with County Judge Ed Emmett, we're pretty sure we have the longest ballot in the country, and that's because it's a county of 4 million people and 2 million voters. So Judge Engelhart has a district bench, which a lot of places in the state covers more than one county. Here we have many district benches like his, and they all just cover Harris County. So I think last election in 2014, we had 47 local contested races in November 2014. So it's a very long ballot. But picking up with what the judge said is I think it's hard for voters to know every candidate on the ballot. So they look for somebody to help them. And there are a lot of groups out there. But one thing I hear a lot, because there are groups I think that pretend to be what they aren't, is that parties, at least certainly the Republican Party, does not endorse in our primary. So people will get mailers, and we call them slates, that purport to be some kind of official publication, but the party does not endorse in the primaries. We stand back. I want the voters to decide. I don't want the party bosses dictating who the winner should be. And we trust our voters to be able to do that. And because it's a long ballot, it takes some work. So which is why everybody kind of wants some help from groups that vet or analyze these candidates. They got to be careful who that group is. Find out who that group is, and did they take money from somebody whom they're recommending.
That's a real issue. There are some. Won't name any names, but there are some organizations or individuals who have wield a tremendous amount of power in the respective parties, and in certain circumstances ask for a significant amount of money to be on a slate. And the slate means they'll mail out a card or hand out a card at the polls that says, vote for these people, and that is very meaningful and makes a substantial difference in the outcome of the election. But that aside, there are a number of influential groups in the county on either side, Republican or Democrat, that people look to with trust to take that card and walk into the polling place and vote exactly what's on that card. And that's a result of a lot of hard work by candidates to earn the trust of those organizations.
So now, something else that was kind of talked about, or hasn't been talked about yet, is vote by mail, right? So Lane, would you be able to kind of discuss a bit what criteria exist out there for people to be able to vote by mail?
There's several criteria. The most used is if you're 65 years of age or older. There's some other categories, such as you're going to be out of town or if you're disabled, but they aren't used as often. But if you're 65 years of age, you're eligible. You've earned the right to vote by mail. Something my parents, who are both well over 65, had never done until I became party chair, and I got them. Now they wouldn't vote any other way. They love it. Predominantly, before I took over as chair, Republicans did an excellent job at getting our senior citizens to vote. Our party did not do such a good job. In 2012, I began looking at that. We had an okay year on it. We certainly upped our numbers. This past year, after having a couple of cycles to wet my teeth on, I finally figured out how to do it. And I think by the time we went into early vote, it was pretty much 50-50 I think y'all had like 51 and we were at like 59, something like that. And that's up from, I think, like 32% in 2012. So we made significant gains in that.
So now from that perspective, you said from a party perspective, vote by mail. So am I to understand that the state doesn't offer that service to people over 65?
They do, but they don't push it. It's not cheap to do, and Paul will tell you it's not cheap to do. I have to first identify, which takes time, effort, and money. I then have to mail you an application. I then have to contact you and make sure you got that application, and if you don't, I need to send you another one. Once I confirm that you've gotten the application, I've then got to convince you to sign it and send it in. And then I've got to call you back to make sure you did it. And once I get confirmation that you did it, a couple of weeks later, I've got to call you back and confirm that you actually got your ballot. And once you got your ballot, then what do I have to do? I have to keep calling you, contacting you, mailing you until your ballot comes off the Stan Stanard's rolls.
Is that not something both parties can work together on?
No.
Definitely not. I should say we both work at it in competition, as you said. And the Republican Party actually had not, as an entity in the past, before I became chairman about a year and a half ago, done that early voting application
Oh,
process.
you're right. I guess it was done by a third party.
It was third parties
You're right.
doing it.
You're right.
So we've stepped into the breach, and our party is now doing it. We just did it for the third time, and I know we're ahead of you right now for the primary, the returns. But he's right. He's absolutely right. It's a process to go through all this effort to get folks to mail in. But it's important, and I think it's important to the integrity of the system that the process be followed properly. But it is hard to get people to mail it in. But once you have that mail ballot, if you qualify for it, it's a lot easier to sit at home and do it.
So is that more of an effect on our cause of the system, or the people who are participating in the system?
Is what the effect?
It seems like it's very difficult.
It's just the process.
Time-consuming.
It's the process.
To be able to do that. I mean, if I'm over 65, it sounded like a lot of steps.
The effort that goes into it to be successful at it as a party is extensive. The process of actually doing it, if you're a voter, is you fill out a piece of paper, you get an application in the mail, and theoretically, without any additional prompting, you would fill out you would get your ballot and you would mail it in. It's just a matter of, do you want to do it well, or do you want to just do it? And if we want to do it well, it takes a lot of what we call chasing the mail ballots, and that is a huge part of any local party's budget and time.
Yeah, let's not confuse folks here. The reason it's cumbersome for the parties is they have a vested interest to pursue these people. But the average citizen, when you turn 65 and you request a ballot by mail, typically, as I understand, we have that data already, and they will mail you a ballot. So it's a very simple step for a person that's out of state, out of town, or as a senior citizen. Very simple step. It's an arduous process for the party because they have a vested interest.
I just wanted to make sure we made it clear so that people understand, right? So
it doesn't look like that from the voters' angle. It just looks like it
Very
from our
simple.
angle.
Right. One other point to be made, too, the legislature's made it easier now. There's a box you can check off if you're over 65 when you do your application, and you'll get those absentee ballots mailed to you the rest of the year for the 12-month period automatically. So they have made it easier even. So if we get folks to mail in an application now, they're going to go ahead and get it for the rest of the elections this year.
I would also point out that if anyone is interested in the data, Stan Stannard's office, our county clerk, will put you on the distribution list so that every night you can receive how many ballots by mail he has attended to. Mm-hmm. So, for example, and I just happened to look this up, in the 29th Congressional District, I think candidate Gene Green, the incumbent Democrat, has requested 2,800 ballots by mail versus his opponent, Adrian Garcia, which was just slightly over 1,000. So it tells you that Gene Green's campaign is a little more active in pursuing, as the parties are, the over 65 mail-in ballots.
Now, what I do want to point out, because you mentioned obtaining information, sourcing information, so I wanted to give some websites. HarrisCountyVotes.com. Harris Votes. Harris Votes, HarrisVotes.com, and that's the site that you're referring to.
That's right.
You can go to find out. Lots of information is there. Another great website that you can also go to is lwvhouston.org. The League of Women Voters releases a voter's guide, and they have fabulous information there as well. So when we talk about voting, one of the things that came out in previous elections was if I go somewhere, what do I have to bring? I mean, it's going to be important, right? I mean, can I just show up and say, hey, I'm here to vote? Will they let me vote?
Well, in the past, simply just being on the voter roll and showing up with a voter card issued by the tax assessor collector of Harris County was sufficient. You didn't have to show any identification. And the burden was on the state to prove that the voter that voted was not who he was, and so that triggered off criminal investigations and whatnot. The legislature recently passed a statute that requires a ID, and there are numerous IDs, passports, Texas driver's licenses, among several others. I think a military ID works, and so now you have to show a valid ID.
It has to be state issued, correct?
Or federal government.
Federal issued, okay. But it has to be photo ID.
Photo ID.
I believe, though, a student ID, even if it's from the University of Houston, for example, or Texas Southern, which is, of course, a government agency, it does not qualify. So you need to have a driver's license or a state-issued ID or passport. And it's very important. Can I make one more other point? We were talking about the deadline to register to vote.
Yes.
I don't want your viewers to think that that's it for the year. The deadline to register for the vote in this primary, which is coming up on March 1st, has passed. However, they can still register to vote and be eligible to vote in the November election, and we certainly encourage them to do that.
And I think it'll also apply for the runoff, too, for the primary runoff. If you go ahead and register today, you'll...
Right.
Yeah.
You have to be, basically the rules, you've got to be registered to vote 30 days before the election. And as Lane points out, there's a primary runoff. If in a few races where there's more than two candidates, you may end up in a runoff election. And that'll be the latter part of May. So if you aren't registered to vote now in March, you could still register to vote in the May election. But one thing to be wary of, you can't vote in one party's primary in March and then go vote in the other party's runoff. That's a no-no. So if you do vote now, recognize you won't be able to vote in the other party's runoff in May if you want.
So are you about to say something, Lane?
No, I was just
Okay.
echoing on what they had said.
So we touched on before, previously you said down ballot, the long list, and I wanted to come back to that and make sure that we let our viewers know and give them an idea of what you were referring to. You said it's a long list of candidates or down ballot, so maybe go into a little bit more detail.
Well, I think we had 70-something in 2014. Was it 70-something judges or something?
Right.
That's the number that comes into my mind. It was something.
It was enormous. And I was on a talk show last year, and the host was making an argument that we should do away with straight ticket voting, and that the voter had a responsibility to get to know everyone on the ballot and then make the best choice, whether Republican, Democrat, or other. And I said, well, that's very easy to say as you sit there on your rainbow unicorn. I said, but I don't think it's realistic. And he said, well, of course it's realistic. I said, all right. I said, I tell you what, let's just talk about, and I had the ballot in front of me, I said, let's just talk about judicial benches, and I named them off. And I said, there are about 6 different people running for those 2 benches. Tell me what you like and dislike about each one of them. Start by telling me their names. Well, he couldn't name one single candidate running for any of those benches, much less the pros and cons. And so to that degree, you kind of have to let the party go through a primary process and pick your poison and walk into the R or the D slot, by and large.
I mean, you can vote you can vote straight ticket in November. You can't vote straight ticket in a primary. Let's make that clear. There's no such thing. It's like dividing by 0. You can't, because you're voting either in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary. So if you walk in and think there's going to be a D or an R lever, that's nonsensical, because everybody on your ballot is either a Democrat or a Republican. And so you have to pick within each race who you want to vote for. Now, it's in November that straight ticket voting comes up, and a lot of people like the convenience of know who they would never vote for a Democrat or they would never vote for a Republican, and so it's very simple to just press the D or the R. And some people don't like that, but if they don't like that and they want to take the time to get to know individual candidates, or they have one particular candidate, we had an interesting issue with the district attorney's race. Was it 4 years ago? The gentleman who's on the ballot again, who shall remain nameless, was someone that a lot of Democrats were uncomfortable with voting for, and so a lot of Democrats would go vote straight ticket, and then they would uncheck that box, which is something you can do. So you can, if there's only 2 or 3 Republicans you want to vote for, but you want to vote straight ticket Democrat, otherwise you just hit the D button, and then you go down and you uncheck and switch in those races, and then at the end, when you get to review your ballot and make sure that it's listed the correct people, and then you press the little cast ballot and your little flag waves, and you're done.
And for completeness, point out you can also vote straight Republican.
Yes.
And-
Is that an option? I was not aware of that.
Check Engelhart.
And then go check your cousin or your brother who's on the
In the
ballot on other
151st
side.
District Court.
But again, that is a straight ticket voting in November, as Judge Engelhart said. I was a precinct chair and election judge myself for 20 years, and there are a lot of voters would come in the primary and say, I want to vote straight Republican. Thank you, but here's you actually have to go down the whole list and pick them individually. And I think so it's a more challenging process in a primary, and maybe that's one reason I should point this out, how much lower participation we have in the primary elections. Because you have to be identified with the party, you feel identified with the party enough to actually go out and participate in its election. So typically, well, let me just say the last election, the Republicans' vote in Harris County was about 7% of the total electorate, and Democrats were probably about half that. I
Yeah,
think.
much less than that. Yeah.
And our peak has been about 8% or so in the past. So a small percentage of the electorate is really deciding our primary races. So whereas a much larger percentage will of course vote in the fall. So in 2012, it was about 60% of the voters turned out. So, but they were only voting on who the 8% had already been on our side, or less, the other side had decided back in the spring. So voters could make a big difference coming out to a primary election rather than just waiting till November.
Absolutely. And the other reason that the primary is so important to the party infrastructure is because an individual like Bernie Sanders, for example,
Who's that?
happens to be running for president on the Democratic side. He turns out a lot of new type of voters, a lot of young voters, a lot of first-time voters. For whatever reason, they're identifying with him extensively. So what
stuff.
What'd you say?
Free stuff.
Free stuff. Yeah. Free. So what happens is if there are individuals out there on campus, for example, young people, that have not identified with Republican or Democrat because they haven't voted, he inspires them to vote in the primary. Well, now we've got someone identified, so in the general, and in generals 10 years from now suddenly we have this whole universe to actually go after and try to get them to vote. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, for sure.
Well, yeah, Quentin,
Yes.
I wanted to point out, there are a lot of folks that choose not to participate in the primary because they feel that they don't go into a database and they're not bombarded with political mail. Because the candidates will find out, for example, we want to know who the 3R voters are, meaning we want to know who the rock-solid Republicans are who voted in the last 3 primaries because they're for sure going to vote Republican in the general. So we as candidates will, to the extent of our resources, bombard them with either phone calls, social media, or direct mail. So people don't participate in the primaries. They're not in the database. So, they truly want to maintain their independence. And so I've talked to a lot of folks that have articulated that position.
So, but I think I've heard the same thing as well, but what people, I think, fail to realize is that a lot of other information is determined by primary turnout.
And not the least of which is when you get to the general election, you're voting on someone that other people have picked.
Right.
You didn't
Exactly.
participate in that process.
Yeah, so we heard this mentioned, brought up earlier, and the term, and I want to make sure people understand it. I heard gerrymandering, right? And so if you could just kind of explain in your own background what that is. What is gerrymandering?
Let me start off.
Well, there was a guy named Jerry.
Elbridge Gerry. Yeah. It was a guy named Elbridge Gerry, I believe, from Massachusetts.
It's always Gerald's fault.
That's right.
Every 10 years, there's a census, and there are
Mandated by the Constitution, I believe.
portions of the state, or portions of the city of Houston, or portions of Harris County grow, shrink, people move, and so for adequate representation and equal representation, the state legislature has to realign the districts for Congress, for state representative, for the senator, not for statewide seats, obviously, school board, city council, and so that process we enter into every 10 years, and it's to ensure that the vote there's proportional representation.
Say when you say, no, again, we try to be as specific as possible. When you say equal, adequate representation, what sort of representation?
Well, that means that one congressional district, let's just take Congress, doesn't have 2,000 citizens, and they have with their 2,000 votes, much more influence in the House of Representatives than a district that had, let's say, a population of 150,000. That means those people have less influence in the Congress. And so they try to make it as even as possible. And they use other factors. I think, now I'm going to let the lawyers talk, but, you get into racial components and you get into all those issues. But essentially is to make it sure that that one vote that's cast in Congress doesn't weigh more than another district.
And I just want to point out that the term gerrymander was invented about 200 years ago.
Okay.
So because this matters, because who people can elect matters, you've always had, for centuries now, fights over how we draw the districts. And it's just a part of democracy. So the districts are drawn based on various criteria. And as Treasurer Sanchez mentioned, that there are Voting Rights Act and other legal matters that get weighed in that drawing of the lines, and needless to say, there's litigation at least every 10 years over this. So it's a lot of time in the courts.
Yes.
So with the term gerrymandering, though, has come. It's one thing to say we have to have equal and proportionate districts. The negative connotation of the term gerrymandering comes from one political party or the other is in power in the state legislature, and they politically divvy up the seats, divvy up the districts within their state, however many U.S. representative seats they have, or the state house representative numbers, or state senate. They divvy them up in a way that favors their party and consolidates their majority in the legislature and makes districts that are safe. It makes districts that are safe for one party. It'll make other districts, but many fewer in number, that are safe for the other party. And so the reason that people look down on gerrymandering, concerned about gerrymandering, is it makes it almost impossible for one party or the other to be competitive in almost any district in the state. There are Republican districts in this state of Texas that are not competitive at all, and no Democrat will win for a decade. There are some that are safe Democrats that no Republican will win for the foreseeable future, and so one of the things that it was interesting in Arizona, there was a referendum. I believe, I could be misstating this, but I believe it was more or less, it was a referendum. All the voters in the state voted, or whatever percentage actually voted. They decided to create a nonpartisan redistricting board. And so it's balanced between Republicans and Democrats, and that organization, that board, creates competitive, and I theoretically anyway, creates competitive districts so that both Republicans and Democrats can actually compete in a given, for example, congressional district within the borders of Arizona. I think that would be a wonderful change and create a much healthier, robust democracy.
I'll
in our
second
state.
that, Paul.
Can I comment? It's funny that Republicans have
And that was upheld by the United States Supreme Court, by the
had
way.
a very close decision because that was a constitutional question, whether or not it was constitutional.
Right, because the issue in the Constitution was the actual constitutional provision says that the state legislature has to do the redistricting. The Supreme Court said that a referendum is okay constitutionally to supplant the legislature under those circumstances.
I just want to point out the Republicans have controlled the Texas legislature for only a little over a decade. It was only early in the last decade. So for the prior century, the Democrats never complained about it.
One of the things.
So this is a new thing, and so now they're complaining about it. Now the Republicans control the legislature, and I must say too, the lines we're under in Harris County and in many of our districts now actually were drawn by the federal court in 2012, which are quite different from what the legislature did.
Because I've sat through a couple of redistricting votes on the city council, for example, we had to redistrict. But not to complicate matters, we in Texas anyway are under the Voting Rights Act, as Paul mentioned, Title V, and part of it, the requirement is to protect minority districts. So when a ethnic minority is elected, we can't do anything to water down that district, so to make it more competitive. For example, and I'll give you two examples. The 29th Congressional District probably won't be won by a Republican anytime soon. The 18th Congressional District, which is held by Sheila Jackson Lee, will probably not be won by a Republican. But conversely, The 7th Congressional District, which is not protected by Voting Rights Act, but because it was drawn, is probably the most Republican district in the state, is going to be held and won by a Republican for the foreseeable future. But with respect to the 29th and the 18th, there's not much that redistricting can do to water down the ability of a candidate of that district's choice based on ethnicity to vote one of their own in.
And I'll think of all the House districts. Paul graded my paper on this, but for example, in Harris County, there's really only 2 I would think are competitive House districts, like 134 out in Pasadena
144.
and 144 over in Meyerland.
It's 144 in Pasadena.
134.
134 in
And
Maryland.
134.
Right, and 144, and just what Lane's referring to, there are actually 24 state house districts in Harris County. There's 150 total in the state, 24 of them are here. They're currently split exactly 12 Republican, 12 Democrat in Harris County. And the District 144, currently held by a Republican, Gilbert Pena, was Democrat before that. Before that it was Republican, so it's been swinging back and forth. And it's probably based on recent results, the closest district in the state in that regard. And 134 has also swung back and forth. But most of our districts, as Treasurer Sanchez said, are not that competitive. But you never know. I mean, and there are demographic changes that also evolve. So I think both parties try to keep up with those changes.
It's led to 134 is my district, and it encompasses Bel Air and some, I think some of Meyerland and West U, and it's led to an interesting anomaly. That is, you actually have a Republican in that district who is currently in that district. Before that, it was Ellen Cohen, who was a Democrat. Before that, I think it was
Scott Hochberg, Martha Wong.
That wasn't Scott, but it was Martha Wong. But the current incumbent Republican is actually pro-choice, or at least pays lip service to being pro-choice, and I think actually votes that way largely because that district is finally split. And it is a highly educated, highly affluent district that actually pays attention to things like that. And frankly, I don't think an anti-choice Republican would win over a moderate Democrat.
So that brings up a very interesting point, because we talk about parties, we talk about the party system, but the overall purpose is to elect and govern. And if elected, regardless of the party, they represent the American people, they represent the citizens of that area. So why is it important that they come from a specific party if they're representing people of various races, ethnicities, religions, and multiple parties?
Well, remember, they don't have to be. You always have the right to write in a candidate, and you always have the right to vote for anybody you want. The reason it's that way is that historically our country has been a two-party system. And the parties are behemoths. I mean, you look at the amount of money spent, and elections aren't inexpensive. They're rather expensive. So it's very difficult for a third party to sort of make its way to the national level. I suspect locally you probably do have some libertarians that have won, some Green Party candidates that have won, socialists that have won, but at least at the national level, most everybody, I think as it was articulated earlier, probably wouldn't be identified either as an R or a D if you want a fairly decent shot at making the general election in November.
And I mean, we're pack people, right? I mean, that's what we do. We separate ourselves out by the color of our skin, by our gender, by, you know, our religion. I mean, that's what we do. We have a pack mentality, and the political infrastructure is no different.
So, go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that though the party label has increasingly come to mean more and more. Once upon a time, you had conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, and by and large, those are extinct creatures. So, you know, there are very few, the old blue dog Democrats in the old days are pretty well become Republicans, or they're no longer around. So there is an ideological split between the parties that's pretty consistent. And so, as Orlando was mentioning, you go to these different congressional districts. If it's a very Democrat one, it's likely going to be a very liberal district, and vice versa. The Republican districts are going to be majority conservative. And so the representatives usually there's two ways to vote, but one of them they'll say is vote your district, and so they vote the way the majority of the people in their district vote.
And so this is.
But the primary process is what drives this, though. We have the primaries within the parties, right? And so you can be, these days, you have to be the most left or the most right to win your respective primary in a given race. And then those extremists, uniformly, but often the most extreme person wins, and those are the two people who are on the ballot.
So for people.
And if you get elected and you don't maintain those extreme views, well, you end up getting primaried, I think. Chair
I've
Simpson
never been accused of being. I've never been accused of being extreme.
Sarah Davis, that's why she's getting primaried.
But I really think that this is a useful process because we fight over values and things that matter and the principles that we stand for. I've said to people who complain about gridlock in Washington that that's really a feature, not a bug. You know, the Constitution, the federal Constitution, was designed to have little progress, little change if there wasn't a consensus on an issue. So I think when you actually are debating over values, things that are valuable, things that matter to you and your principles, then that's why we have these fights. But I would encourage more voters to get involved in their parties, in their primaries, and play a bigger role. And just to pick up on the numbers we mentioned earlier, in Harris County, for instance, 2012, I think Lane would confirm these numbers, we had about an even number of people vote straight ticket in both parties, 400,000 both parties. Probably 300,000 of those on our side don't come to our primary. So there's 300,000 straight ticket Republican voters who don't even come and vote in our primary, and you have similar numbers on your side.
Even lower.
Or even lower. So those are members who I would say strong Republican voters. Why aren't they coming out to our primary? And they really should and get involved. It's just more work involved to learn the candidate.
Well, that's a great point. And Quentin, you know, a lot of people complain about national politics and the platforms of the parties and the rules governing who is nominated eventually as the candidate for president. You know, we're talking about potential of brokered conventions and so forth and so on. If you don't like the rules and you don't like the platforms of a party, there's absolutely no way you're going to change it unless you go to a primary election. And then after the polls close at 7 p.m., you come back for your precinct convention and lend yourself out as a candidate to be a delegate to your senatorial district convention, to your state convention where the state rules are written and where the state platform is written. And then you have to be elected to be a national delegate to the national convention where the same process is repeated. That, I think people underestimate, is where the real power lies in the hands of the people. And people don't, I think sometimes they fail to understand that that's where the real power is. We're beholden to the rules of the party and generally to the platform of our party. And those are written by the grassroots.
And that is a perfect segue because I definitely wanted to get into that next. So I'm a voter, all right? It's early voting again is February 16th. And then extends until the 26th. Primaries is March the 1st. So March the 1st rolls around. I have my voter ID. I go into the polling location and I say I am affiliated with whichever party. I'm allowed to vote. Then what? What happens next?
After you've voted, and this is a little different this year for the Democrats than it is for us. So I'll tell you the Republican side.
Okay.
We have precinct conventions, as Treasurer Sanchez just mentioned, in available in every one of the precincts in Harris County. Now, we're going to have over 400 polling locations where you go vote. And wherever that precinct you go vote in on election day is where, after the polls are closed at 7:30, or when the polls close if they go a little later, the voters in that precinct who voted in that party can come and meet in the Republican side. The Democrats are going to do theirs later. But the Republicans will meet after the primary election is over, the evening of March 1st. Now, this is important to let early voters know this. About half of our folks or more vote early. And so we want to remind them, you can still come back the night of the election on March 1st in your neighborhood or in your local polling place and participate in the precinct convention. And it's open to anybody who voted in that primary, essentially, there's some details, but essentially every voter in that precinct who voted in that primary can come to that convention and get involved in the process that Orlando mentioned.
So it's called a convention, but it's more like a town hall,
it's a
caucus meeting.
Sometimes it's 8 people, sometimes it's 50 people, but it's voters from your area. And the next step we do You may pass resolutions there if you want, but the main thing you do is also, as elected delegates, to a couple of weeks later go to district conventions on Saturday, March 19th. Both parties have the same day, I believe. And I don't know what Democrats are doing, but for the first time in 20 years, I've moved our conventions back out into our neighborhoods, in our districts. And these are done by state Senate district, of which there are all or parts of 8 of them in Harris County. So we're going to have 8 separate conventions around the county on March 19th, starting at 9 in the morning. So, and then get involved in the process going on up to the state and national conventions.
Okay.
And the neat thing is, Lane, just let me jump in. If you ever want to experience politics in this country at the grassroots level, you don't have to say a word. Just go after the polls close and watch, either on the Democratic side or the Republican side, and you will experience impromptu campaigns. Some people go in there with no intention of lent themselves out as a candidate for delegate to the senatorial or state convention, and sometimes some of the liveliest political fights will develop in these precinct conventions.
So now explain to me. So I'm a Republican. I've already voted. I'm going to my Senate district.
I knew it.
Hypothetical.
Good, glad
Now, I put on my blue hat, and I've got my voter ID. I walk in the polls and I say, okay, hey, I want to vote in the Democratic primary. I cast my ballot. Then what?
Well, if you're voting in the Democratic primary, we're doing our convention system differently. You can actually sign up right now. If you go to harrisdemocrats.com and you just look there on the first page, and you'll see something that says how to be a delegate to the state or national convention. You click on it. You can actually sign up, and you sign a pledge that you're going to vote in the Democratic primary. Now we're just collecting data so that we can communicate with you about your Senate districts. Now you still have to actually go vote in that primary on March 1, right?
Or early vote.
Or early vote. So once you've voted in the Democratic primary on March 19th, we don't have precinct caucuses on the close of March 1. We used to, the same way y'all do it. We don't do it that way anymore. Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to go to your Senate convention. You're going to go straight to Senate on March 19th, straight to the Senate on March 19th. And you show up, we'll be able to identify that you indeed are a Democrat and voted in the Democratic primary. At the beginning of those Senate caucuses, Senate conventions, you'll have a precinct caucus.
Okay.
See? And then that's where you'll be able to identify, you want to be a Hillary delegate, or you for Bernie Sanders, what's your favorite flavor in that regard, to become a delegate to the Senate convention, which will start subsequently after those precinct conventions close. And then that's how you become a delegate to the state convention. We like to balance our state convention, make sure that we have, as best we can, equal representation of people of color, LGBT, handicap, women, etc. We like to have a balanced representation as best we can to go to the state convention. And then, like the treasurer said, then that's where your resolutions have to be passed. That's where our platform is created, and that's how you get to go to Philadelphia for the national convention.
So now you're touching on these things. Now, where is the state convention going to be held in Texas?
In Dallas, it's going to be in Dallas in May.
And what day is that?
You would ask. May, I think May 12th to 14th,
Okay.
about mid-May. It's actually before the runoff election for the Republican side. So again, we're going to have our district conventions in Harris County on March 19th, Saturday, and all the locations are on our website, the harriscountygop.com.
Say that website again.
harriscountygop.com,
Okay.
one word.
No spaces.
And the locations, right. The locations of all the district conventions are there. We've set them. And then the state convention will be, again, in mid-May in Dallas. Now, one thing I want to point out, it may be different on the Democrat side, but, we've got this. You may have heard there's a presidential election going on.
I think so, yes.
So, of course, this voting is starting, and you see how delegates get picked. In the Republican side now, we still pick all of our delegates by the vote actually done at the ballot box. So, at least for the first round, and this is what makes it kind of exciting, if one of the candidates wins, and we do it by congressional district, say, and as well as statewide, but one candidate wins a congressional district, then the delegates who go to the national convention from that district, there'd be 3 of them, are pledged to vote for that candidate, at least the first round. But then the rules change after that. If nobody wins at the convention, then it sort of becomes ultimately a wide open process. So then it matters who the delegates were, who actually went up, whose candidate they were. So they're bound at least the first round, but then it could become real interesting later. But we'll see. That depends on what happens in the primaries in the coming months.
Okay.
Our state convention is going to be in San Antonio this year, San Antonio, and it's going to happen on June 17th.
Okay.
That weekend. It's about 3 days.
And so is there a website we can go to?
harrisdemocrats.com. If you look for the button that says how to be a state delegate, you click on that. It'll have the form, and it'll have where all your Senate district conventions are. It'll have all their dates and addresses and all that, and you just sign up.
I like to give examples of the meaning of participating in that process. So let's say that you are an ardent homeschooler and you want legislation in Texas that requires homeschooling. You want to do away with public education, let's say, hypothetically. You visit with voters in your precinct that are homeschoolers, and you all show up to the convention at the precinct and you start writing resolutions and get elected, and you filter your way up all the way to the state. And then you get homeschooling on the platform. You get resolutions encouraging the legislature to adopt homeschooling. It doesn't have to be homeschooling. It can be anything you want.
Sure.
But that essentially is American politics at the grassroots. And I get frustrated when I hear Americans who have the right to vote say, why should I vote? It doesn't make a difference. It does make a difference. It makes a difference at that very beginning, at the primary election, and that's why it's important to participate in the primaries and go to those precinct conventions, because that's where the game changers originate.
That's a very good point. So
I was just going to say, as a candidate in 2008, it was the Democratic side in Harris County was one of the most exciting elections there ever was, because Hillary and Obama were neck and neck at that point, and Texas had a huge impact, or would have had a huge impact. I think ultimately they just about split the state between the primary voting and then the caucusing that occurred after. But going to those Senate conventions were packed to the gills. They were all over the county, and there were overflow out on the grass outside the buildings. You couldn't hear people, and the energy was so exciting. If you were at all interested in politics or the political system, I encourage you to get involved in your respective parties' convention process all the way up through state and if possible through into the national convention, because it is something you will never, ever forget.
I'll make a point about that too. Both parties have a spirited fight right now going on, obviously for the nomination in each side.
you don't say.
You may have noticed, but the Republicans have never had the presidential race alive at the time it came to Texas, and we're just less than 4 weeks away, and we think we're still going to have multiple candidates running for president on the Republican side. So for the first time ever, that Texas will be able to make a difference, we think, in the presidential nomination, because on March 1, there's going to be, they call it the SEC primary, because it takes up much of the South, as well as other states, I think Colorado and Wyoming and some others. A lot of states will vote that night. But it is a historic opportunity in Harris County to make, further on the Republican side, to make a difference in the presidential nomination and who our nominee ultimately is. And so we're expecting a large turnout, and we certainly want people to get involved and participate.
Paul, and I would ask you to inform the viewers, because some states, and Lane can jump in, are winner take all. That means if you win that state, you win all the delegates from that state going to that convention in the national convention.
Sure.
But I think Texas, we changed. Now we're somewhat of a formula that is proportional. So
it's a complicated formula, right, and varies with different percentages. But number one, a lot of the delegates are chosen just within the congressional district level. You have 3 delegates from each level there, and then you have statewide delegates. And how those delegates are allocated can vary depending on how the votes split up. So yes, it's not a winner-take-all, a pure winner-take-all at all.
And those rules apply to both parties?
Yes, what we do is we say, okay, in this particular district, how many people voted in the primary, and then there's a ratio of how many delegates you get per, actually ours is based on the gubernatorial election.
Ours is too.
How many people voted, and so a percentage of that tells you how many delegates you get. And then on the primary, if you get, I don't know, 5 delegates for that area, and 3 of them went to Hillary and 2 of them went to Bernie. Okay, well, that's how many delegates you get that go up the chain.
But you also have at-large delegates, where there's so you have the primary determines that I think 75% of the delegate allocation, and then you have another. I believe the other 25% are what are called at-large delegates, which come from the grand poobahs in the state party, or how does that work?
Yeah, yes, and the DNC just forced us to redesign our whole delegate process. They didn't like the way that we were doing it, and for the last several election cycles, they kept telling us that they were not going to seat us at the national convention if we didn't change it. And we kept not changing it, and they kept seating us until finally the DNC this past year said, okay, this time we really mean it. And so the state party redid our delegate process.
And then the rules are, not to complicate matters, but for example, in general elections and gubernatorial elections and whatnot, those are determined by the election code of the state of Texas. So if you're bored tonight, you can go, you can Google the statute, which is the election code, but in the primaries, is what Lane was talking about, is generally dominated by the rules of the parties. So it's quite complicated, but the bottom line is, if you want to experience American politics and you want to exercise your power and you want to make a change in this country, go to your precinct convention and vote in the primary.
So now that's
where the power
I make one last pitch too. The other thing I still like about Harris County, unlike some counties, is we still manage our elections, both parties, with volunteers. And it's tremendous citizen involvement, and we always need more volunteers, both parties do, to even run our elections. The primaries are actually run by the parties, technically. So they can go to harriscountygop.com, for instance, and volunteer to be election workers, judges, and learn about the process and get involved in a serious way.
So that was the next thing I wanted to add, was that if you're out there and you are interested in voting and you want to participate, Harris County GOP.
harriscountygop.com.
And harrisdemocrats.com.
Okay.
And don't forget, we have elected officials that are whose duty it is to answer questions for you on registration. Stan Standard's office, Harris Votes, will post all the voting locations, all the times. The parties have phone banks that are probably almost 24 hours a day right before the election. So you call your party or go to Harris Votes, and that's why we're elected, to serve you.
And we appreciate it. So I want to take this opportunity to thank our guest, Judge Mike Engelhart, Harris County Treasurer Orlando Sanchez, Lane Lewis, Chair of the Democratic Party in Harris County, and Paul Simpson, Chair of the Republican Party in Harris County. So if you definitely want to get involved, I'll say those websites again. It's harriscountygop.com, harrisdemocrats.com, and I'll also mention the other websites, judgeengelhart.com.
It's ENGELHART.
OrlandoSanchez.com as well.
Thank you, Quentin.
And no, not a problem. And also LWVHouston.org for great information. And also, if you're interested in finding out exactly where to go to vote, because in Harris County you're designated to go to your precincts, but we encourage you to vote early. And again, those voting dates are February 16th. Last early voting day is February 26th. Primaries on March 1st. And on behalf of the League of Women Voters Speakers Bureau, my name is Quentin Wiltz. I really appreciate the opportunity to tune in. Tune in next time, and we thank Houston Media Source as well. Have a good evening.